For next year, are you optimistic about the global economy or pessimistic?
Pessimistic.
I'm cautious. I think whether the whole curve goes up 100 basis points, be prepared for it. I don't know if it's going to happen.
I do believe the Federal Reserve is going to have to raise rates higher. We will not see a hard or a soft landing in 2024.
And we're starting to go down. Next year perhaps is not so wonderful, but then you'll hit your bottom, we'll go up again.
Some of the most informed people in this world have gathered in Riyadh to discuss the economic landscape we are currently facing and predict the economic conditions in the 2024. I have summarized the most important and interesting parts of this summit and put it into one video.
For next year, are you optimistic about the global economy or pessimistic?
Pessimistic. You have a political, you have a monetary, you have a conflict type of environment. So if you take the time horizon, the monetary policies that we're going to see and so on will have greater effects on the world. And you look at the world gaps, so it's difficult to be optimistic on that. Now, the real issue, I think, is how we deal with each other. If we can keep a peace, if we can have a healthy, competitive environment without having a war with each other, we will be in good shape. We will make adaptations.
Ray Dalio is a very successful investor and founder of Bridgewater Associates, the biggest hedge fund in the world. Traditionally, Ray Dalio has presented his framework view of the world on a conference, which he describes in his book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. According to Ray, the world is transitioning from a period of prosperity and relative calm to a period of chaos, which is not necessarily incompatible with prosperity though. The period of chaos is caused by the disruption of the world order that has up until now shaped the world. This old order has been established until recently by an unchallenged power, the United States of America. But now there are powers that are trying to compete directly with the old power, and that is the Eastern Bloc led by China. This is creating a rivalry between the old order and the new power that is taking shape, which is leading to many changes of rather negative nature that are now creating challenges in the politics. The wars in Ukraine and Israel and the looming conflict in Taiwan are probably just a direct result of this rising rivalry. In addition, income inequality has been long on the rise in the Western society, leading to growing populism among the country's citizens. As for 2024, Dalio is pessimistic about economic developments due to the Fed's monetary policy as well as the potential escalation of geopolitical conflicts. According to Dalio, in the coming decades, the new powers will be the countries that avoid major wars, do not face internal conflicts, and spend less than they earn, which is not the case of, say, United States.
I'm generally an optimist. I think you'd be foolish not to look at some of these things taking place today in Ukraine, Middle East. Obviously, my heart goes out for Ukraine, but also it's affecting oil, food prices, gas prices, migration, potential starvation is probably the most serious thing we faced. And I hear people talking about ESG all the time. I just would put on your table the most serious thing facing mankind is nuclear proliferation. If we're not sitting here 100 years from now, it will be nuclear proliferation. It's not climate. And then I look at the financial situation, the fiscal spending, which is more than it's ever, I'm talking about the United States, but it's almost true around the world. It's more than it's ever been in peacetime by a long shot, with the highest debt levels we ever had by government. And there's this kind of omnipotent feeling that central banks and governments can manage through all this stuff. I'm cautious. I don't think it makes a piece of difference whether rates go up 25 basis points or more. Like zero, none, nada. I think whether the whole curve goes up 100 basis points, I urge people, be prepared for it. I don't know if it's going to happen. But I look at what we're seeing today more like the 70s. A lot of spending, a lot of it's going to be wasted. I mean, I would be quite concerned. And the other thing about when you look at economics, I think people prepare for possibilities and probabilities, not calling one course of action, since I've never seen anyone call it. I want to point out that central banks 18 months ago were 100% dead wrong. Okay, so maybe there should be humility about financial forecasting. I would be quite cautious about what might happen next year.
Jamie Dimon is CEO of JP Morgan Chase, the biggest bank in the USA. Nuclear proliferation is now the greatest risk to humanity, overshadowing the risks of climate change, Dimon said. He says world needs real leadership to get us out of this situation, but he does not hold out much hope for this scenario. He expressed concerns about the evolution of US fiscal deficit. He said that this was the fastest borrowing in a period of no apparent need, as the United States is not directly facing a war and is definitely not facing a slow economic growth. Dimon compares today's political economic situation to the 1970s, when inflation failed to be tamed and second and even third wave of inflation followed, with the price level rising at a higher rate each time. Now, he probably doesn't predict the similar situation will occur this time, but there are some similarities between those times. He's cautious about 2024, and now he sees a rise in the entire US yield curve of around 1 percentage point as a potential risk. This would mean higher yields of US government bonds regardless of the maturity of the bond, which would significantly slow the economic growth and make risk assets less attractive. He countered that he did not foresee this scenario, but that it was good to be prepared in case it occurs. He also mentioned the need to be humble about financial forecasting in the light of the fact that the Fed was 100% wrong about its forecast 8 months ago. And they were wrong especially in relation to inflation, when the Fed assumed that it was only a transitionary phenomenon, which obviously it was not.
David, we're going to see higher interest rates for longer. This reminds me of the 70s. It was all about bad policy. Today it's about bad policy again. And big macro shifts, as Ray spoke about it. The politicization of supply chains, the fragmentation is a big result of it. That is inflationary. Let me also say populism is very inflationary because we respond to the immediacy of the moment. We don't talk about long-term issues. As we see more and more countries move to the far right, we see more threats towards immigration. The lack of immigration is very inflationary, especially in economies like the United States. I'm talking about legal immigration. So the deficit's grown by more than $1 trillion each year over the last 23 years. That is highly inflationary. The balance sheet of the Federal Reserve is highly inflationary. And so all these different measures are much more structural, much more difficult. So as a result of that, interest rates are going to remain higher. We will not see a hard or a soft landing in 2024. The amount of fiscal stimulus that is just entering the economy, which is very inflationary, and you see in labor settlements right now what's going on, and labor talk, 25% increases in wages. So I don't see a problem, but I do believe the Federal Reserve is going to have to raise rates higher, which probably will mean by 25 we may have a soft, we may have a hard landing. That is the only way I see how we're going to be arresting this, but I don't expect it anytime soon. I think the power of the economy, the power of the consumer that Jamie is giving me comfort that the economy is fine. Obviously, other parts of the world, the European economy is facing much more severe headwinds.
Larry Fink is CEO of Blackrock, the biggest investment manager in the world. It has assets under management of over $9 trillion, beating other managers such as Vanguard or Amundi. Fink anticipates higher key interest rates for an extended period of time. The reason for this, he says, is structurally higher inflation in the years ahead, until this effect is offset by the development of AI, which would have a deflationary effect on the economy. Inflation is expected to be higher because of populism, where such politicians are elected to the power, which will put the US in more debt to satisfy their voters. Fragmentation of supply chains is also said to play a part, with many companies leaving China for other countries as part of risk management, but making production more expensive, which is inflationary, of course. Also, central banks are now pursuing a policy that was rather unthinkable previously and forbidden even. This has stimulated the economy during the 2020 pandemic, and it had significantly inflationary effect. Fink also predicts higher Fed interest rates. He says the US economy is still resilient and strong, but European economies are less so. Finally, Fink also mentioned that if the situation in Israel does not calm down, there's a risk of high levels of terrorism globally. and this will lead to lower consumer activity and slower economic growth across the globe.
If these things are not resolved, it probably means more global terrorism, which means more insecurity, which means more society is going to be fearful, less hope. And when there's less hope, we see contractions in our economies. And so I think there is consequences to war and to fear and to instability. And I think it will lead to less hope and a lot more fear. And it will then lead to a much greater contraction if we don't navigate this as a world.
But I think the real challenge for Europe is near-term and probably medium-term growth. It will get inflation under control, although there is the potential for a second wave. Wage inflation is still not under control in Europe, and particularly in the UK. So therefore there is the potential for persistent high interest rates and high inflation in Europe. I am concerned about a tipping point on fiscal deficits.
All right?
I think it won't come gradually. When it comes, it will come fast. And I think there are a number of economies in the world where there could be a tipping point and it will hit hard.
Noel Quinn is the CEO of HSBC. He's worried that Europe is facing the problems of slow economic growth as well. He thinks inflation can be tamed, but he fears the second wave of inflation and notes that wage growth is way too strong in European countries. That implies higher ECB rates for longer, he says. Quinn also worries about the direction of the debt situation in many Western countries, where the situation can very quickly lead to negative events when debt levels rise way too high.
But I also look at it from a cyclical point of view. I've been through 6 of these cycles in my career, and now we're coming off the top and we're starting to go down. So that would say to me that next year perhaps is not so wonderful, but then you'll hit your bottom and then we'll go up again.
Unlike his colleagues, Steve Schwarzman, CEO of Blackstone, does not track high inflation, and in the third quarter he says that the input inflation tracked by Blackstone was 0%. This showed that production costs are normalizing in some parts of the economy at least. But the biggest inflation problem is in the service sector, not the manufacturing. The manufacturing sector has already suffered from the impact of high interest rates, which cannot be said about the service sector, which will take longer to reach. Schwarzman said 2024 will not be a wonderful year, but like many other cycles before, it will find a bottom, probably in the next year, from which everything will bounce up higher again.
Long term, I'm certainly optimistic, but I'm uncertain right now. And if you're a CEO and you're uncertain, you tend to be cautious about doing significant things that change the trajectory of your business and bring outside factors into your business.
All in all, it does seem that 2024 will be a continuation of the hardships we are going through at this moment. Many expect the climax to occur the next year, that would force the Fed to lower interest rates and thus reset the cycle. Larry Fink was onto something by suggesting that not even 2024 may be the climax year. Fiscal or government interventions are significantly compensating for the effects of higher interest rates, thus artificially prolonging the cycle. Therefore, it really may be that the end of this cycle won't come until 2025, further growth of bond yields is possible, and rates will remain higher for longer, because getting inflation down to 2% is never easy from such highs, and historically this was never a fast process. It will take time, and the investing landscape may be very different to what we have been used to in prior decades. Unprofitable high-growth tech may not be as hot anymore, because liquidity is tighter, debt is more expensive, and economic growth will probably be subdued. It does seem that more traditional investing style will have more success, i.e. the stronger balance sheet, stronger income statement, high cash flow, and sound fundamentals. In any case, we're finding ourselves in the middle of very exciting and at the same time scary period.